And our final speaker for today for the session, we're thrilled to add Mark Rasenick, who can bring physiology, biophysics, and psychiatry together in his talk, and a beautiful mustache as well. He's a distinguished professor at University of Illinois in Chicago, and he'll talk about global mental health policy, not just for rich folks anymore. Welcome.
Got it? Okay, so I actually decided on a different title, which is a little more depressing, and at the same time wanted to show you something that is my own antidepressant on every Wednesday. Even better, it's not my boat, but that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. It'll center on depression. We'll talk about other psychiatric issues as well, and talk about globalization of mental illness as a problem and those meager solutions that might be on the horizon. Okay, so how do I go forward? This? Just the keyboard. Yeah. This? Okay. It's right here. If you pull this out, that should take you. Okay, so these are US numbers, and we'll talk about worldwide as well. You know, I don't, here in the US, when we turn on the local news, right, and we see, and how does it lead? Murder after murder after murder, right? Do you know there are 3 times as many suicides in the US as there are homicides? And if you're killed with a gun in the US, it's more than twice as likely to be a suicide as it is a homicide. And I also mentioned here that 22 veterans, I also have an appointment at our VA, and 22 veterans die by suicide every day. And at this point, we're talking about second in disability, but you'll see in the numbers that come up that mental health, and particularly depression, will be number 1 in cause of disability by 2020. If you picked up a copy of The Economist as you came in, there was an article on mental health, and there it says, it lists psychiatric disease as second to other, as a leading cause of disability-adjusted life years. In addition to that, it's very difficult to discuss depression and other psychiatric disorders as independent from somatic disorders, particularly that depression will increase disability, particularly in the elderly, and in fact, the mortality if you're depressed from heart disease is going to be significantly higher than those without. And then we get to numbers. And in this, for depression alone, we're talking about 1 in 6 worldwide has had or will suffer from depression at some point in their lives. You know, in fact, but then we have another issue, and that stigma. So let me ask you a question. How many of you are taking meds for hypertension and or cholesterol, statins, right? How many of you are taking antidepressants? Okay, I didn't expect to see any hands. Okay, but we know that probably there are more people that are taking antidepressants. Okay, but we have a major problem with stigma. Oh, I'm working the wrong. Here we go. So, what's depression like? And you know, it really is a difficult thing. Okay, and that's what it's like. It's just an endless spiral of misery. Okay. Now, having said that, what happens? What are the stressors that are going to cause depression? And this is worldwide. One is endogenous. I mean, this is something that happens. And in fact, it was interesting when we saw John Allen's slide about inflammation, and you didn't do this, but you noticed that depression wasn't on there, right? We didn't, and clearly, although no one's been able to figure out exactly what's going on, there is a clear link between inflammation and depression, okay? But when we see an article in the general medical literature, that one's forgotten. It's somatic, okay? And we're going to get back to that in a moment. Financial, worldwide, is a terrible cause of depression. And in fact, when we deal with suicides outside of the US, we'll see how they are completed in a moment, and how much of that has to do with financial problems. And then we got trauma. You know, and this includes post-traumatic stress disorder, which is anxiety, but we're going to lump it all together because, you know, the biochemistry just isn't there. We try and put these diseases into neat little boxes, and they don't fit. Okay, they really don't. Okay, and in fact, the NIMH is trying to do this research domain criteria to try and get out of these, use more symptoms rather than quote unquote disease. But at any rate, we've got violence, and this is worldwide, war, natural disasters, and all of these things are going to contribute to psychiatric issues. 1 in every 6 people suffer from depression. And remember, but you notice only about, of those people that suffer, only about half of them are diagnosed. Okay, and why is that? That's the stigma. Even if you are diagnosed and it's clear that you become depressed, you're often unwilling to seek help for it. Okay, and then notice here that only of those people who are diagnosed, only 20% of them are treated adequately, and unfortunately, as you'll see in a moment, about a third fail to respond to drugs. So what's going on? Why the problem with this inadequate treatment? Well, one of the things is, as you'll see in a moment, a lot of the treatment takes place, in the U.S., 80% of medication for depression is prescribed by primary care docs. Okay, they're treating most, and so gynecologists probably are treating more depression than psychiatrists in the U.S. What's the cost estimate? Well, the New York Times had $500 billion for depression alone. $500 billion. That's really, and it's really hard to figure out what that number is. And the reason is because you have not just specific direct costs and specific medical costs and loss of work, but you have people that go to work, sit at their desk, and cry. Okay, or presenteeism. Okay, that is an actual loss. That's an economic loss, and that occurs throughout the world, of people who are functioning sort of normally, but not normally enough so that they're contributing to society. Are there a number? Sure, there are a whole bunch of different therapies, and I've listed them here. It's not important to go over the list exhaustively. You notice that the last one is combinations, because since only antipsychotics they're the more branded antipsychotics are available than branded antidepressants now. You turn on the television in the U.S. and you'll see how an antipsychotic is going to help your depression. Why? Because that's still available non-generically, not because it's okay. So are new drugs needed? And the answer is, of course they are. Because as you'll see in a moment, we have about 30% of people that don't respond. Okay? And we'll get into the private-public issues in just a moment on that. So look here. In terms of people who don't respond, this is something that each time you try, there's a trial. There are a number of people that respond and a number of people that don't. And by the time you get to the edge here, that number, that fourth trial, you have a number of people who have failed. And ultimately, that number adds up to about 30%. So 30% of people aren't responding to any drug. Now, one of the curious things here is that, is it possible that one of the reasons for this is that the repeated failures are setting you up to fail? And we don't know the answer to that. Is it your biology? And now we're talking worldwide, or is it the repeated failures that are the problem? There's no good answer for that. Okay, but there's some, and the only way to get at that is to develop biological markers for these diseases. We don't have them yet, and that's what we really need to do. Okay, so is this a result of repeated failure? What's the problem? Well, one of the problems we have with both depression and all mental illness is stigma. It discourages people from seeking treatment. Another problem is that it takes too damn long for these drugs to work. So now I'll do the biophysics part and I'll use the word hysteresis. Okay, do people know the word hysteresis? Right, it's a good enzymology word. Okay, it means the lag time, and in this case, a lag is 6 to 12 weeks before you have effective therapeutics. Okay, and that's a real problem. If you're struggling, and you're told, well, you'll get better, just wait a few months, sometimes you don't feel you have those few months to wait. Okay? And another problem we have is from the psychiatric literature itself. What we call response means if you give a number to depression, and let's say you use a number of 30 on a Hamilton depression rating scale, and you went to a 15, hey, you responded, great. Except you know what? 15 is still miserable. Okay, that's not good enough. And in addition to that, we have a problem from pharma. And one of the problems is that as the money to do public research has declined, those of us who do that research have found fewer and fewer new targets for these drugs. All the low-hanging fruit is gone. Pharma has manipulated, say, taken a methyl group off and gotten a new patent. They've done that to the extent that they can. There are no new real targets. And if we don't come up with new real targets, they don't come up with new drugs. And those 30% of people who didn't respond to the standard drugs are still struggling. Okay. So how do we fix it? Well, and this is worldwide again, all of us have to approach depression and other psychiatric problems as a neurobiology issue. Because if it's all in the science, if it's all neuroscience, it can't be stigma. I spent a year as a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow with Senator Kennedy, and he made the comment, "It is an outrage that a person with a biochemical problem in their liver is treated with compassion, yet one with a biochemical problem in their brain is scorned." Okay, and that's a real problem. We got to get over it. Okay, and then if we understand the molecular and cellular basis, we're going to help to fix that. And we also need these biomarkers, particularly in the peripheral circulation. If we can find it in the blood, then we can begin to deal with it more quickly. All right, so take a look at this. So here are our disability-adjusted life years, and you probably can't read this worth a damn, right? Okay, and this is from the World Health Organization. What's important is if we go over to developing regions and look at that top line, unipolar major depression, leading cause of disability worldwide by 2020. That's not so far away. If we look at the developed regions, it's ischemic heart disease. Okay, but if we looked at that Economist article and we added other mental illness, you can see that we're already at that leading cause of disability. Okay. And it's not, and you know what? So, and 86% of suicides and 75% of the global burden of neuropsychiatric disorders are in those low and middle income countries. Yet we continue to ignore this. You know, as I said, let's go back to that article that's coming out. And the idea was, we don't see the psychiatric disease. I know that, I look, first-year medical students, 90% of them are hostile to the idea of psychiatry. They want to be real doctors. They don't want to look at stuff that's going on in the brain that they can't understand. And if that's in the US, don't you think it's going on everywhere in the world? Okay, so let's look at the economic, in terms of non-communicable diseases, we're going up and up and up, and mental illness gets to be number one. Okay, and that's, and our US, so here are global, and this is NIMH, the global costs in 2010 were estimated to be 2.5 trillion and 6 trillion for 2030. That's a lot of money. Okay, but at the same time, our treatment has increased. The number of prescriptions, and again, this is the US because it's hard to get these data, our number of antidepressants and antipsychotic prescriptions have increased. And I told you again, the reason for the antipsychotics is not that there's more psychosis, but the antipsychotics are being used for depression as well. Okay. And so I got these from Bill Potter, who's at the NIH, formerly ex-Lilly. Okay, and he said that his inconvenient truths were that there is increased treatment, okay, as measured by epidemiology and prescriptions, but we still have, there's no, mortality and morbidity haven't gotten any better. So there is an increase in availability of drugs, there is an increase in treatment, but we're still getting sick. And one of the problems is that the prevalence is increasing, and another problem is that the delivery is still inadequate. Okay, and then the third is that the current treatments are not effective enough, and we need something new. Okay, and then at the same time, pharma has really shut down into its psychiatry. A number of companies have just closed it, and some, unfortunately, are on the way out. Some people who have made very important strides in mental health, some companies who have decided that this isn't where we're going to be able to make any money. Okay, and part of it is because we haven't found the targets, because federal funding in the U.S. has dropped by 25% over the past decade, and there's no new targets. Okay. Also, since the market is saturated with generics, pharma is not as interested in going and finding new things, and failure is very expensive. Okay. So let's get back to that issue of the biomarkers and an issue of trying to find something that's going to help those folks with the circle around them. Okay. And what I wanted to do here, and what happens to those people. So I wanted to talk about suicide for a second. Okay. And here's a list of the global suicide rates. Lithuania is up at the top. Russia and Belarus, Kazakhstan are very high. China is particularly high. India is particularly high. We're kind of in the middle somewhere. You see, we're in that 10 range. But Cuba and the U.S. are very close to one another. We'll mention Cuba again in a second. But in that middle range, and then it falls off. I think one of the reasons that you have that fall off is not because there are fewer suicides, but there are fewer suicides reported. I mean, accident and suicide often are difficult to distinguish, and it's easier to call it an accident than it is a suicide. But okay, so these are some of the rates that we have. Now, let's take a look again at how this happens. Well, in the U.S., firearms are far and away the greatest cause of completed suicide, in part because if you attempt suicide with a gun, you're probably going to complete it. Okay. One of the interesting things, though, is I found this, that there are two countries where there is pervasive gun ownership. One is the U.S. and the other is Switzerland, yet the suicide rates by firearms in the U.S. are very high, and in Switzerland, they're fairly low. Okay. So what about treatment? What about the availability? Look at the difference between Western Europe, where it's 1 in 10,000 psychiatrists per person, and Central Africa, where it's 1 in 400,000. But there are a lot of faith healers. Okay. In fact, I was in Doha last week, and they were explaining to me how prevalent faith healers are. But many of these faith healers actually are good conduits. People go talk to them, and they recognize and try and get folks into treatment. So the idea of utilizing that, and I use the term faith healer in a very general way, utilizing that as a resource is something that globally we probably need to think about and pan into, because if folks are going to go see them, and are going to go see them first, let's figure out a way to make it work. Okay? And is there a fix? Well, more psychiatrists is not a fix. It's not going to happen. There aren't going to be enough to really make a difference. Even in the U.S., most of our mental health services are provided by social workers, and that's fine, as long as we train more and more people that can do that, work with these faith healers, work somehow to get people into treatment. If we don't do that, our fix is going to continue to be more prisons. Because at this point, in my own hometown of Chicago, where the Cook County Jail is considered to be the largest mental health facility in the country. Okay, and that's unacceptable, because they're not providing services. They're just locking people up, and they're not getting better. Okay, and don't think that doesn't occur everywhere in the world. So what other things can we do? Well, will throwing money at it help? Well, I love to, this is my favorite, whenever someone says that, I say, yeah, well, look at AIDS. Throwing money at it can help, as long as you do it correctly. And when we were looking through private funders, and Vaughn and I had written something for science diplomacy about this, you look at the Gates Foundation website, and mental health, there are like 2 or 3 instances where even the phrase occurs. Okay, now they're doing very important things, right? There's no one would argue with that, but nobody wants to get involved. It's much easier to get involved with the quote-unquote tangible health problems. So global funders aren't particularly interested in mental health, even though it may be the biggest problem we have. Okay, and another road, Cuba is going to come up now often today, and I've been there a few times. We're not sure of the number. We think it's 20. But one of the things that's interesting in psychiatry is the Cubans always would say to us, well, we don't have psychopharmacology, we have syncopharmacology, because we have 5 drugs. Okay, it's gotten a little better than that now. But they do have a program where schizophrenics who are well enough to live outside of an institution, the family members are paid a stipend to take care of their schizophrenic family member. Okay, and this is something that isn't very expensive, but has the possibility of being very effective and being very useful. And it's something that we need to explore more. We need to develop alternate strategies, we need to develop inexpensive strategies, and we need to develop the biology. And maybe together we will come up with a global strategy for addressing psychiatric illness. That's it, thanks.